After finishing the gauge swatch and figuring out the correct needle size to use, it's time to cast on for section 1 of the sweater. I have a little sample sweater, a tiny little sweater here for you that shows the construction of this sideways modular pattern. Each section of our full-size sweater is represented here in this tiny sample as a different color. And we're going to start here with our section 1 with this mustardy yellow section here that is the center front, the right front. So when you're confused about right and left, think about which arm goes into which sleeve. So your right arm goes into the right sleeve. So when you're wearing it, this will be the right side because your right arm is going to be in this sleeve, and this is going to be the left side because your left arm is going to be in this sleeve here. So what we're going to start with is section 1 here, which is the right front. And we're going to cast on stitches here in the middle of the sweater, so the middle of the neckline, the middle of the sweater, and we're going to work in this direction. So I'm going to tilt it here so we have it in the working direction. So we're going to cast on stitches here with a long tail cast on, and we're working neckline shaping on the beginning of the right side rows. Depending on which neckline you're choosing, the shaping will be a little different. And the section ends here at the top of the shoulder where the neckline ends as well. So that's our first section, and we have a closer look at all the techniques that are needed for this section here in a moment. For section 1, we need the main color as well as the main needle size. I'm using a circular needle here just for personal preference, and because I'm going to later use the cable of these circulars as a stitch holder as well. So to cast on stitches, we're using the long tail cast on. You might think that it would be a good idea to use a provisional cast on because we're going to work in a different direction later, the sweater. But because we want the pattern to meet perfectly in the middle, we need to cast on stitches and then pick them up from the cast on to work in the different direction. If we would use a provisional cast on, the pattern would not meet perfectly in the middle. So the long tail cast on it is. You can use a different method if you have a preference, but I'm going to show you what I'm doing here. So the most difficult part about the long tail cast on is to figure out how long that tail needs to be of that long tail cast on. And like the rule of thumb is that it should be about 3 times the length of what you want to cast on. So what I usually do is just hold it onto the body part that I want to kind of cast on for. So I would then hold this tail end here like to the middle of my body from where I think the cast on would be to about the length of the sweater and go for about 3 times that length. You can use like the measurements from the schematic as well, but it shouldn't be like you don't have to measure it out centimeter per centimeter, you can just eyeball it as well. So for the long tail cast on, I don't do a slip knot, I start with the cast on right away. So I'm holding the tail end is to the back here and the ball end is to the front. And I'm holding this here to tension a bit. And then I'm holding this, bringing this tail end over my index finger and over my thumb. And then I hold it in place again somewhere down the line. And this span here of yarn is what I use to cast on. And for the first stitch, I insert my needle, needle is in my right hand, under this thread here that runs from my index finger to my thumb, just underneath it, and pick it up. And I'm using the thumb of my right hand to hold it in place on this needle here, because that's already the first stitch that I'm casting on. And after that, the actual cast on motion begins. I'm using my left hand and I'm twisting the left hand to bring the thumb towards the left, and then I'm using my needle to go under this thread that is closest to you, under it, and then go to the thread that is over the index finger and go over it and bring that thread from the index finger through those loops here, and then I drop the yarn from my thumb and I pull to tighten. And I'm still holding on to this thread here that is towards the tail end, and I never drop that, so that's always my tensioning bit here. And then I bring it back over my thumb, and again twist the thumb, go under this one here, go over the one from the index finger and pull it through. And then you drop it from the thumb and you pull to tighten. And to pull to tighten, I already go back with my thumb to pick up that next loop. Under, over, pull through. And you repeat that for however many stitches you want to cast on. And you can see that this first stitch doesn't have this knot that you'd get from a slip knot, and so that's a bit of a nicer way to start the long tail cast on. The number of stitches you need to cast on depends on the length of your sweater and on the neckline option. So the tighter the neckline, the narrower the tighter fitting towards the neck, the more stitches you need to cast on, and obviously the longer the sweater, the more stitches you have to cast on as well. So you'll find the correct number in your pattern. I'm making a tiny mini version, so I'm only going to need a few stitches here. And if you want to see how that looks in like full speed, it's about like that. So that is my cast on complete. And if you take a close look at this cast on line here, this is what I consider to be the right side. And if you turn it around, you can see those little pearl bumps, and that is what I consider to be the wrong side of the cast on. It doesn't really matter too much here because there's a lot of reverse stockinette in our pattern, but this is what I usually want to have on the right side, and this is the wrong side. So I'm going to start this setup row on the wrong side with a purl stitch. That's my edge stitch on the wrong side. It's always a purl one at the beginning. And the next stitch is going to be already one of those slipped stitch pattern stitches, and this is a wrong side, so I'm going to bring my yarn to the front and slip this next stitch purlwise with the yarn in front. And the next 3 stitches are going to be knit. So between the slipped stitches, there's always 3 knit stitches on the wrong side. So either 3 or 7. And then there is another slipped stitch, so slip with the yarn in front. And depending on your size, that's kind of how many times you need to repeat that. You'll find it in your pattern. I'm making a tiny version, so I'm actually going to make the pattern ever so slightly differently than your full-size sweater would be. So slipping with yarn in front. And then I knit those last 2 stitches before my edge stitch, and then I purl the edge stitch again. So that's the setup row complete. And again, the exact number of stitches you need to knit and slip are in your pattern. I'm making a tiny sample version of it, so it's going to be looking differently from yours. But what you can see is that every so often there is a stitch here on what is now the right side, which doesn't have a purl bump, and those are the stitches that we slipped on the setup row on the wrong side. And these are going to be those traveling graphic stitches that make the design of the sweater. So as I showed you before, we're going to make this section here, which has increases at the beginning to shape the neckline, and there is a straight edge here at the end of the right side row. So that's what I've cast on here now. Because I'm going to make my tiny little sample sweater a V-neck, I'm going to start increasing here right away on my first right side row. But if you're making a crew neck or a rounded neck, you'll have to knit a couple of rows or several rows straight before making increases, and that will make a more rounded neckline. So I'm starting my row with a knit 1 edge stitch. And then I'm purling the next stitch. So I bring the yarn to the front, purl the next stitch. And then I'm making an increase and make one left purl. For the make one left purl, you pick up this thread that is between those 2 stitches from the row before, from back to front. And then you purl the stitch through the front loop. That's the make one left purl. The next stitch is already a 1 by 1 right purl cross. And that means I'm going to change the order of the next 2 stitches to bring the second stitch to the front. That's going to be this knit stitch, and this purl stitch here is going to move further to the left. And to do that, I'm going to skip the first stitch and I'm going to knit the second stitch. So I'm kind of going around this first stitch on my needle, and I just knit this first stitch, and then I carefully, slowly take both of those stitches off my left hand needle. And when you tilt your hand a little, you'll see the loop here from the stitch here that was not knit, that was skipped, and you bring it back to your left hand needle. So we already worked the knit stitch here, and we're going to purl this stitch here that was skipped originally. So those 2 have now traded places in our 1 by 1 right purl cross. And in this section we're going to only work right purl crosses. So I'm going to purl until I reach 1 stitch before my next knit stitch. So the knit stitch is the one that doesn't have a purl bump here below. And I'm going to skip the first one, and I'm going to knit this second stitch here. Take both of them off my left hand needle and bring the first one back to my left hand needle again and purl it. And that's the 1 by 1 right purl cross finished. So there's a longer length of purl stitches until I reach again 1 stitch before the next knit stitch, or before the next slipped stitch. And I'm going again knit that second stitch on a needle, slide both off the left hand needle and bring this first stitch back, and then purl that one. And I'm going to do that one last time. Knit the second stitch, slip both off the left hand needle, bring the first one back to the left hand needle and purl it. And then there's only 1 last stitch left, and that is my edge stitch, and I'm going to knit that one because I'm on the right side. And as you can see, we have already established our slipped stitch pattern. There is a longer length between those, and there is another 2 here. So for your full-size sweater, you'll have a repeat of 4 slipped stitches that are closer together, and then a longer length, and then another set of 4 of those. And on the wrong side, there is no increases and there is no crossing, but we're going to start again with a purl 1, and we're going to knit all the knit stitches, And whenever we see a purl bump, we're going to bring the yarn to the front and slip the stitch purlwise with yarn in front. So all the knit stitches will be knit, and all the ones that have those little purl bumps, we're going to slip them with yarn in front, because those are our traveling stitches that make up the pattern. And here at the end, that is the last one that I'm slipping, and this was here the increased stitch, the stitch that we increased, and I'm going to also knit this one here, and I'm purling the last stitch of my row, my H stitch. And when I turn around, you'll be able to see those slipped stitches that are kind of growing, the traveling slipped stitches that form our pattern. They're slowly moving to the right because they're right purl crosses, so they're moving towards the neckline. So let's make another increase here at the beginning. So I'm starting with a knit one and a purl one, and then I'm working another increase, make one left purl. I pick up this thread that is between my stitches from back to front, and then I purl the stitch with the yarn in front. So I insert the needle here through the front loop, and then I purl the stitch. And I make another one by one right purl cross right after my increase. And that's the way you work until you have finished all your rows. And that's pretty much all the magic of section 1. If you're an English style knitter, not a continental knitter, this is what those right side rows look like. So I'm starting the row with a knit 1 H stitch, and then I'm purling the next stitch, and then I pick up that next stitch for my make one left purl from back to front, and with the yarn still in front, and then I purl into this like front loop of this picked up stitch, and then make a 1 by 1 right purl cross. I bring the yarn to the back because the next stitch I'm going to knit is a knit stitch, so I'm going to knit this second stitch here on my needle, and it will change the order of those 2 stitches, and I'm sliding them off my left hand needle and bring the first stitch that I skipped back to the left hand needle and purl it. And then I purl until I reach 1 stitch before those knit traveling stitches. So once you have a couple more repeats, it's easy to see. So I'm again 1 stitch before my knit traveling stitch, and I'm skipping the first stitch here, my left hand needle, and I knit the second one. Slide both of my left hand needle and bring the slipped stitch back to the left hand needle and purl it. Another 1 by 1 right purl cross. I skip the first one and I knit the second stitch. Slide both off the left hand needle and bring the skipped stitch back to the left hand needle and purl it. And then I purl until I reach my last stitch of the row and knit my last stitch. my finished section 1 looks like this, and you should probably have more rows than I do, but I'm making a tiny little version of the sweater, so this is what I have. In your full-size sweater, you'll have 4 of those traveling knit stitches that are closer together, and then there is a large gap, so I'm making a tiny one, so I just made 2 of them. So I hope that's not too confusing for you. What you can see here is that one of those edges is a straight edge, and that's going to be where my hem is going to later be picked up from. Then I have the cast on, which is at the center front of the sweater, and then the right edge here is one that has shaping. My shaping here started right at the beginning because I'm making the V-neck option. But if you're making a different neckline, like the rounded or the crew neck, you'll have a bit that is straight, and then your increases start. So this edge here is not straight, that is at an angle. And let's pick up this tiny little swatch here and I'll show you how this fits into the whole of the sweater. So this part that we've knit is fitting into this part of the sweater. So that's the mustardy yellow part, and you can see here that the angled edge here is going to form like a quarter of the neckline. And the cast on is right at the middle of the sweater, and the straight edge is where our hem will later be worked down from. After finishing this first section, break the yarn. Don't leave it like a too short of a tail, because we make sure that's not going to fall off. So after finishing the first section, I break my yarn and I slide the stitches onto the center of my cable, onto this cable part, and to secure it and leave it there and park it while I work the next section.